I see another one of you soldiers who thinks his service entitles him to special treatment.
Your Honor, I'm here to handle a traffic ticket.
Racist judge fined the wrong veteran. He had no idea that fine was the last act of his career. The traffic stop had been routine until Judge Harold Whitmore spotted the defendant's service ribbons. Master Sergeant Marcus Williams stood at attention in Courtroom 3B, his dress uniform immaculate despite the bogus speeding citation that had brought him before the bench. "I don't care what costume you're wearing, boy." Whitmore sneered, his gavel already raised. "Fine is $5,000 for disrespecting an officer." But the judge had no idea he was about to destroy the wrong man's life and end his own career in the process. Marcus had survived 3 combat tours in Afghanistan, earning a Bronze Star and Purple Heart through blood and sacrifice. The 34-year-old logistics officer commanded respect from generals and enlisted men alike. But in Whitmore's courtroom, he was just another target for judicial racism. What happened next would prove that some battles are fought in American courtrooms rather than foreign battlefields, and that justice sometimes wears combat boots. Millbrook County Courthouse, squatted like a monument to institutional prejudice in rural Georgia, where Judge Harold Whitmore had dispensed his particular brand of justice for 15 years. The year 2024 brought national attention to judicial misconduct, but small-town courtrooms remained fiefdoms where corrupt judges ruled without accountability. Whitmore's docket was notorious among civil rights attorneys, a systematic pattern of harsh sentences for black defendants and lenient treatment for white offenders. The courthouse's marble facade concealed a culture of racism that permeated every level of the justice system. Court clerks, bailiffs, and prosecutors had learned to anticipate Whitmore's prejudices, adjusting their behavior to match his expectations. Defense attorneys whispered warnings about Whitmore's courtroom, where justice was determined by skin color rather than evidence. Master Sergeant Marcus Williams represented everything Whitmore despised: an educated black man who'd achieved success through merit rather than deference to white authority. Marcus's journey from Atlanta housing projects to military leadership was a testament to perseverance and excellence. His mother, a hospital janitor, had scraped together money for his college tuition while working double shifts to keep food on the table. The Army had recognized Marcus's natural leadership abilities, promoting him rapidly through the non-commissioned officer ranks. His logistics expertise had kept supply lines open during the most dangerous phases of Operation Enduring Freedom, earning him recognition from commanders who valued competence over politics. His Bronze Star citation read, "For exceptional meritorious service and outstanding leadership under enemy fire." But Whitmore saw only a black man who needed to be reminded of his place. Marcus's current assignment at Fort Stewart brought him through Millbrook County, regularly transporting supplies and personnel between military installations. He'd never had trouble with local law enforcement until Officer Danny Crawford stopped him for allegedly doing 47 mph in a 35 mph zone. The citation was questionable. Marcus's military training emphasized precision and rule following that made traffic violations unlikely. The traffic stop had been routine until Crawford noticed Marcus's military insignia. The officer's demeanor had shifted from professional to hostile, his questions becoming increasingly aggressive and disrespectful. "Think that uniform makes you special?" Crawford had sneered, adding, failure to comply with lawful orders to the speeding citation despite Marcus's complete cooperation. Judge Whitmore's reputation for racism was well documented but legally protected. Civil rights organizations had filed complaints with state judicial conduct boards, but the good old boy network that controlled Georgia politics ensured that Whitmore's behavior faced minimal consequences. His sentences averaged 40% higher for black defendants than white ones, but proving discriminatory intent required evidence that racist judges were skilled at concealing. The broader context was a criminal justice system that disproportionately punished people of color while protecting white privilege. Studies showed that black defendants received longer sentences for identical crimes, faced higher bail amounts, and were more likely to be incarcerated for minor offenses. Whitmore's courtroom was an extreme example of a national problem that affected millions of families. Marcus's case would expose the systematic nature of judicial racism while demonstrating that some targets were more dangerous than others. His military training, legal knowledge, and connections within the Defense Department made him uniquely qualified to fight institutional discrimination. The judge, who saw an easy target, was about to discover that he'd chosen the wrong veteran to victimize. The collision between military honor and judicial corruption would test fundamental principles of American justice. Marcus had sworn an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, but he'd never expected to face those enemies in an American courtroom wearing judicial robes. The courtroom felt like hostile territory as Marcus stood before Judge Whitmore's bench, his military bearing creating a sharp contrast to the institutional racism that permeated the space. The hearing was supposed to be routine plead, guilty to speeding, pay the fine, move on with life. But Whitmore's opening comments revealed deeper prejudice that transformed a simple traffic case into something much more dangerous. "I see we have another one of you military types thinking your service entitles you to special treatment," Whitmore declared, his voice dripping with contempt. "Let me be clear, in my courtroom, everyone follows the law regardless of what costume they're wearing." The word costume hit Marcus like a physical blow, reducing his 20 years of military service to theatrical performance. Marcus's response was measured but firm. "Your Honor, I'm here to address the traffic citation. I was not speeding, and I followed all lawful orders during the traffic stop." His military training emphasized respect for authority, but it also taught him to report accurately and stand by the truth when challenged. Whitmore's reaction was swift and revealing. "Are you calling Officer Crawford a liar boy?" The racial epithet hung in the courtroom air like poison gas, witnessed by court staff who'd heard such language before, but never from someone capable of fighting back. "I find you guilty of speeding and contempt of court. Fine is $5,000 payable immediately." The arbitrary fine was clearly punitive rather than legal, designed to punish Marcus for challenging white authority rather than address any actual traffic violation. $5,000 represented months of savings for most people, but for Marcus, it was less about money than principle. He'd seen too many battles to surrender without a fight. "Your Honor, I request appointed counsel and formal documentation of these proceedings." Marcus stated, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd commanded soldiers in combat zones. The request was legally sound and procedurally proper, but it clearly surprised Whitmore, who was accustomed to defendants who couldn't afford lawyers or didn't understand their rights. The judge's response revealed the depth of his arrogance and racism. "You'll get what I decide you get, boy. Pay the fine or spend 30 days in jail. And don't think your military connections will help you here. This is my courtroom, and I make the rules." The threat of jail time was likely illegal, but Whitmore's confidence suggested he'd used similar tactics before without consequences. The system was designed to protect judges from accountability while giving them nearly unlimited power over defendants who lacked resources to fight back. But Marcus wasn't a typical defendant. His first call was to the staff judge advocate's office at Fort Stewart, where military attorneys immediately recognized the constitutional violations in Whitmore's handling of the case. Captain Sarah Chin, a Harvard Law graduate who specialized in civil rights cases, agreed to represent Marcus pro bono while coordinating with civilian attorneys who'd been monitoring Whitmore's courtroom for years. The second call was to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, where attorneys had been building a case against Whitmore based on statistical analysis of his sentencing patterns. Marcus's case provided the kind of documented evidence they needed to file federal civil rights charges, a decorated veteran subjected to obvious racial discrimination in a state courthouse. The third call was to his commanding officer, Colonel James Rodriguez, who immediately understood the broader implications of the case. "Sergeant Williams, you're not just fighting for yourself, you're fighting for every service member who's faced discrimination in civilian courts. You have the full support of this command." The network of support was mobilizing rapidly, but Marcus understood that the battle would be fought in legal trenches rather than foreign battlefields. His military training in logistics and planning would prove invaluable in coordinating multiple legal strategies while maintaining operational security. The judge who tried to humiliate him had accidentally declared war on the United States Army. The preparation phase would test Marcus's character and resolve while revealing the full extent of Whitmore's corruption. But the master sergeant who'd survived Taliban ambushes wasn't intimidated by a racist judge who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. The battle was joined, and Marcus intended to win. Judge Whitmore's response to Marcus's legal representation revealed the full extent of his arrogance and institutional protection. When Captain Chen filed motions challenging the excessive fine and demanding discovery of Whitmore's sentencing patterns, the judge dismissed them with contempt that bordered on judicial misconduct. "I don't care if President Biden himself vouches for this defendant, the fine stands as ordered." The escalation began when Whitmore attempted to have Marcus arrested for failure to pay court-ordered fines, despite the pending appeals and constitutional challenges. The warrant was illegal and vindictive, designed to intimidate Marcus into submission while demonstrating Whitmore's absolute power within his jurisdiction. But the judge had miscalculated the consequences of targeting a federal employee with security clearance and military connections. The Army's response was swift and decisive. Colonel Rodriguez contacted the FBI's Civil Rights Division, formally requesting investigation of judicial misconduct affecting military personnel. The complaint triggered automatic review procedures that couldn't be dismissed by local political connections or judicial immunity claims. Federal involvement transformed Marcus's traffic case into a constitutional crisis that threatened Whitmore's career and freedom. The media attention intensified when investigative reporters began examining Whitmore's 15-year pattern of discriminatory sentencing. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution's analysis revealed that black defendants in Whitmore's courtroom received sentences averaging 60% longer than white defendants for identical crimes. The statistical evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, providing context for Marcus's case that destroyed any claim of isolated incident. The community polarization was immediate and intense. Millbrook County's white establishment rallied around Whitmore, viewing federal investigation as outside interference in local affairs. Black community leaders and civil rights organizations saw Marcus's case as validation of complaints they'd filed for years without acknowledgement. The divide reflected broader national tensions about racial justice and institutional accountability. Marcus's character was attacked by Whitmore's supporters who portrayed him as an outside agitator, using federal resources to attack local institutions. Anonymous social media accounts spread rumors about his military service, questioning his decorations and suggesting that his Purple Heart was undeserved. The attacks were coordinated and vicious, designed to undermine his credibility while reinforcing racial stereotypes. The legal battle intensified when Whitmore's attorneys filed motions claiming judicial immunity and federal overreach. Their argument was that state judges couldn't be held accountable for sentencing decisions, even when those decisions violated constitutional rights. The legal theory was dangerous. If accepted, it would shield judicial racism from federal oversight while protecting corrupt judges from accountability. Marcus's transformation during this period was remarkable. The soldier who'd faced enemy fire with calm professionalism now applied those same skills to legal warfare. His testimony before federal investigators was precise and devastating, documenting not just his own treatment, but patterns of discrimination he'd observed in Whitmore's courtroom. His military bearing lent credibility to accusations that might have been dismissed if made by other defendants. The institutional support continued expanding as more military personnel came forward with similar experiences. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos testified about her own encounter with Whitmore, who'd sentenced her to community service for a minor traffic violation while dismissing identical charges for white defendants the same day. The pattern was becoming undeniable and legally actionable. The breakthrough came when court stenographers protected by federal whistleblower statutes provided transcripts documenting Whitmore's racist language and discriminatory practices. The evidence was comprehensive and damning, including audio recordings of the judge using racial slurs and making comments about keeping these people in their place. The documentation destroyed any defense based on judicial discretion or legitimate sentencing variations. The pressure on Whitmore intensified when the Georgia State Bar began ethics proceedings based on federal findings and media reporting. Bar discipline was separate from criminal prosecution, but professional sanctions could end his judicial career even if criminal charges failed. The multi-front assault on his position was coordinated and relentless, reflecting the seriousness of the constitutional violations. The political implications expanded when Georgia's governor faced pressure to remove Whitmore from office through executive action. The process was complex and politically dangerous, but public opinion was shifting against judicial racism as Marcus's case attracted national attention. Civil rights organizations that had been fighting similar battles for decades saw an opportunity for meaningful reform. The economic impact was equally significant as federal contracts and military spending in the region faced review. The Defense Department couldn't ignore systematic discrimination against service members, while federal agencies began examining whether Millbrook County should receive continued funding. The economic pressure was designed to force local accountability where moral arguments had failed. Marcus's personal growth during this crisis was profound. The quiet professional who'd served his country without seeking recognition was forced to become a public figure advocating for civil rights. His speeches at military bases and community centers were powerful and moving, combining personal experience with broader principles of justice and equality. The reluctant hero was becoming an effective advocate for institutional change. The countdown to Whitmore's downfall was accelerating as federal investigators compiled evidence for criminal prosecution. The charges would likely include violation of civil rights under color of law, conspiracy to deny constitutional protections, and judicial misconduct that rose to the level of federal crimes. The penalties could include imprisonment and permanent disbarment, ending not just Whitmore's career, but his freedom. The battle was approaching its climax as all the various legal, political, and social pressures converged on a judge who'd believed himself untouchable. Marcus had proven that targeting the wrong veteran could trigger consequences that no amount of judicial immunity or political protection could prevent. The crisis exploded when Judge Whitmore, facing mounting pressure from federal investigation and media scrutiny, made a desperate attempt to destroy Marcus's credibility through fabricated evidence. Working with corrupt officers in the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department, Whitmore orchestrated additional charges against Marcus based on falsified police reports and planted evidence. The conspiracy was criminal and obvious, but it demonstrated the lengths to which racist institutions would go to protect themselves. The fabricated charges were serious assault on a police officer resisting arrest and possession of illegal weapons. The timing was calculated to undermine Marcus's credibility, just as federal prosecutors were preparing civil rights charges against Whitmore. The strategy was crude, but potentially effective if Marcus was portrayed as a violent criminal. His testimony about judicial racism would be dismissed as revenge rather than justice. The planted evidence was discovered during Marcus's arrest at Fort Stewart, where military police immediately recognized the setup. The weapons found in his barracks were traced to the Millbrook County evidence locker, while the assault charges contradicted security footage showing Marcus in meetings with his commanding officer during the alleged incident. The conspiracy was so clumsy that it actually strengthened the case against Whitmore while adding federal charges for evidence tampering and false imprisonment. Marcus's darkest moment came not from the false charges, but from the realization that American institutions he'd sworn to protect were willing to destroy him to maintain white supremacy. The soldier who'd fought for democracy abroad was experiencing its failure at home, where corrupt officials could fabricate evidence and manipulate legal processes without immediate consequences. The psychological impact was devastating. Marcus had survived combat stress and physical wounds, but institutional betrayal attacked his core beliefs about justice and service. The country he'd bled for was willing to sacrifice his freedom to protect racist judges revealing fundamental contradictions between American ideals and American reality. The military's response was immediate and overwhelming. Colonel Rodriguez placed Marcus under protective custody while Army investigators documented the conspiracy and its participants. The Defense Department's Inspector General launched a formal investigation into civilian interference with military personnel, while the FBI expanded their civil rights investigation to include criminal conspiracy charges. The breaking point came when Whitmore's allies attempted to have Marcus's security clearance revoked based on the fabricated charges. The attack on his military career was the final escalation in a campaign of institutional harassment designed to silence his testimony and discredit his character. But the attempt backfired spectacularly when military investigators uncovered the full scope of the conspiracy. The evidence of criminal conspiracy was overwhelming and undeniable. Phone records showed coordination between Whitmore and corrupt sheriff's deputies, while financial records revealed payments to officers willing to falsify reports. The paper trail was extensive and detailed, providing federal prosecutors with everything needed to file racketeering charges against the entire network. The media explosion was immediate and national. The story of a decorated veteran being framed by a racist judge captured public attention in ways that abstract discussions of judicial discrimination couldn't achieve. Cable news channels featured Marcus's story hourly, while social media campaigns generated millions of supportive messages from veterans and civil rights advocates. The community response was polarized and intense. Military families throughout Georgia rallied to Marcus's defense, organizing protests and letter-writing campaigns that demanded accountability. Civil rights organizations saw the case as validation of their long-standing complaints about judicial racism, while conservative groups dismissed the charges as federal overreach designed to undermine local authority. The institutional crisis deepened when Georgia's Judicial Conduct Board was forced to acknowledge the criminal conspiracy while defending their previous inaction on complaints against Whitmore. The board's credibility was shattered, their claims of oversight revealed as institutional protection for corrupt judges. The scandal threatened to expose the entire state judicial system as systematically biased and professionally incompetent. The personal toll on Marcus was severe but survivable. His military training and resilience and his support network of fellow veterans provided emotional resources that civilian targets of institutional racism often lacked. His wife, Sarah, a nurse at the base hospital, became his anchor during the darkest moments when the conspiracy threatened to overwhelm his faith in justice. The turning point was approaching as federal prosecutors prepared to announce charges against Whitmore and his co-conspirators. The evidence was overwhelming, the media attention was intense, and the political pressure was irresistible. The judge, who'd believed himself untouchable, was about to learn that targeting a federal employee with military training and institutional support carried consequences he'd never imagined. The conspiracy had failed completely, achieving the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of silencing Marcus's testimony, it had provided additional evidence of institutional corruption while generating national attention that made cover-up impossible. The racist judge's desperate gamble had sealed his own fate while validating every accusation Marcus had made about judicial discrimination. The federal courthouse in Atlanta buzzed with anticipation as news crews and civil rights activists gathered for the announcement that would end Judge Harold Whitmore's career. U.S. Attorney Patricia Williams stepped to the podium with the measured authority of someone who'd spent months building an unassailable case against judicial corruption and institutional racism. Today, a federal grand jury has returned indictments against Judge Harold Whitmore, Sheriff Deputy Danny Crawford, and 3 other defendants on charges of conspiracy to violate civil rights evidence, tampering, and abuse of power under color of law. Williams announced the charges carried potential sentences of 20 years in federal prison, while automatic disbarment would end Whitmore's judicial career regardless of trial outcomes. The evidence presented was overwhelming and methodical. Phone records documented the conspiracy to frame Marcus, while financial records showed payments to corrupt officers willing to falsify police reports. The paper trail was extensive and detailed, demonstrating criminal intent that destroyed any claim of legitimate law enforcement action. Marcus's vindication was complete and public. The fabricated charges were dismissed with prejudice, while federal prosecutors apologized for the institutional failures that had enabled Whitmore's criminal behavior. His security clearance was restored with commendations for his courage in exposing corruption, while his commanding officers recommended him for early promotion to sergeant major. The military's response was swift and comprehensive. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin issued a directive requiring annual training on civilian-military relations and procedures for reporting judicial discrimination. The policy changes were designed to protect service members from future institutional harassment while providing resources for legal advocacy when discrimination occurred. The community reaction was immediate and polarized. Military families and civil rights supporters celebrated the indictments as validation of their long-standing complaints about judicial racism. Conservative groups condemned the federal prosecution as overreach, but their arguments were undermined by the overwhelming evidence of criminal conspiracy and constitutional violations. Judge Whitmore's downfall was swift and complete. Within hours of the federal indictments, the Georgia State Bar suspended his law license pending criminal trial. The Georgia Judicial Conduct Board, previously protective of corrupt judges, voted unanimously to recommend his removal from office. Governor Brian Kemp, facing intense political pressure, signed the removal order that afternoon. The plea negotiations were brief and decisive. Faced with overwhelming evidence and potential decades in prison, Whitmore's attorneys advised immediate surrender. The judge, who terrorized defendants for 15 years, found himself in shackles, experiencing the criminal justice system from the other side of the bench. His guilty plea included cooperation agreements that exposed additional corruption throughout the judicial system. The sentencing hearing was packed with Marcus's supporters and Whitmore's victims, many testifying for the first time about years of discriminatory treatment. The federal judge noted that Whitmore's crimes struck at the heart of American justice, warranting the maximum sentence of 15 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. Marcus's testimony during the sentencing phase was powerful and restrained. "Your Honor, I didn't seek this fight. It was forced upon me by a system that viewed my military service as threatening rather than honorable. But I'm grateful that my experience can help prevent other veterans from facing similar discrimination." His dignity under attack had become inspiration for institutional reform. The ripple effects extended far beyond Millbrook County. The Department of Justice launched investigations into judicial discrimination in 12 other districts, where similar patterns had been reported. The scrutiny was intense and unprecedented, forcing systematic changes in judicial conduct, oversight, and accountability procedures. The legislative response was immediate and bipartisan. Congress passed the Veterans Justice Protection Act, creating federal oversight of civilian courts that handled cases involving military personnel. The law included mandatory reporting requirements for sentencing disparities and whistleblower protections for court personnel who reported discriminatory practices. The civil litigation that followed was equally significant. Marcus's lawsuit against Millbrook County resulted in a $2.3 million settlement and comprehensive reforms in law enforcement training and judicial oversight. The money was substantial, but the policy changes were more important, creating accountability mechanisms that would protect future defendants from institutional racism. The cultural impact was profound and lasting. Marcus's case became required reading at law schools and judicial training programs, demonstrating how institutional racism operated in practice and why federal oversight was essential. His story inspired similar cases nationwide as other victims of judicial discrimination found courage to challenge corrupt systems. The transformation of Millbrook County was comprehensive. The new judge appointed to replace Whitmore was an African-American woman with extensive civil rights experience. The sheriff's department was placed under federal oversight, while the county government implemented bias training and accountability measures. The institutional culture that had enabled racism was systematically dismantled. Marcus's personal transformation was equally remarkable. The quiet professional who'd served without seeking recognition became a national advocate for veterans' rights and judicial reform. His speeches at law schools and military installations were powerful and moving, combining personal experience with broader principles of justice and equality. The broader military response validated Marcus's sacrifice and courage. Veterans Affairs created new programs supporting service members facing civilian discrimination, while the Pentagon established liaisons with state court systems to monitor treatment of military personnel. The institutional support demonstrated that Marcus's individual battle had achieved systematic change. The long-term implications were significant and lasting. Whitmore's prosecution established legal precedents that strengthened federal oversight of state courts, while the Veterans Justice Protection Act created permanent mechanisms for preventing judicial discrimination. The reforms were comprehensive and enforceable, ensuring that Marcus's experience wouldn't be repeated. The final ceremony was held at Fort Stewart, where Marcus received the Meritorious Service Medal for his courage in exposing corruption and defending constitutional principles. Secretary Austin personally presented the award, noting that Marcus's service to justice was as important as his service in combat. The recognition was formal acknowledgement that fighting institutional racism was as patriotic as fighting foreign enemies. The resolution was both personal and institutional. Marcus had not only cleared his name, but exposed systematic corruption that had affected thousands of defendants. His courage had triggered reforms that would protect future generations of service members from judicial discrimination, while his dignity under attack had inspired others to demand accountability from American institutions. The Marcus Williams Protocol became the standard for protecting military personnel from civilian judicial discrimination throughout the United States. The comprehensive approach included federal oversight mechanisms, mandatory bias training for judicial personnel, and streamlined procedures for reporting discriminatory practices. The model was implemented in all 50 states, creating systematic protections that prevented future cases of institutional racism. The immediate consequences transformed not just Millbrook County, but judicial systems nationwide. Federal prosecutors used the precedent established by Marcus's case to investigate similar corruption in 47 other jurisdictions, resulting in additional indictments and convictions that demonstrated the national scope of judicial discrimination. The prosecutions sent clear messages that racist judges would face federal accountability regardless of their political connections or local protection. The legislative impact was equally significant and lasting. The Veterans Justice Protection Act created permanent federal oversight of civilian courts handling cases involving military personnel, while establishing ombudsman offices in each federal district to investigate complaints and coordinate responses. The law included mandatory data collection on sentencing disparities and annual reporting requirements that made discrimination impossible to hide. Marcus's transformation from traffic defendant to national advocate was remarkable and inspiring. His testimony before congressional committees led to additional reforms in military-civilian relations, while his consulting work with state judicial systems helped implement bias prevention programs. His expertise in identifying and combating institutional racism became nationally recognized, leading to speaking engagements and policy positions that expanded his influence far beyond Millbrook County. The cultural impact was profound and measurable. Law schools integrated Marcus's case into their curricula on judicial ethics and civil rights, while the story became required reading for judicial training programs. The case study demonstrated how individual courage could expose systematic corruption while inspiring others to demand accountability from American institutions. The ripple effects continued expanding years after Whitmore's conviction. The federal oversight mechanisms created by Marcus's case prevented dozens of similar incidents, while the bias training requirements improved treatment of all minority defendants in civilian courts. The reforms were comprehensive and enforceable, creating lasting change that protected vulnerable populations from institutional discrimination. Marcus's military career flourished despite the institutional challenges he'd faced. His promotion to sergeant major was accelerated in recognition of his courage and leadership, while his assignment to the Pentagon gave him opportunities to influence policy at the highest levels. His expertise in logistics and institutional reform made him invaluable to senior leadership implementing diversity and inclusion initiatives. The judicial reforms initiated by Marcus's case became models for international human rights organizations monitoring institutional racism in democratic societies. The comprehensive approach to accountability and prevention influenced legal systems worldwide, demonstrating that individual courage could catalyze global change when supported by effective advocacy and institutional commitment to justice. Marcus's legacy proved that military values of honor, courage, and commitment extended beyond battlefield service to encompass defense of constitutional principles at home. His willingness to fight institutional racism despite personal cost and professional risk, demonstrated that true patriotism required challenging American institutions to live up to American ideals.